you, Chair. I just wanted to look, if I could, at Appendix 1, Mr. Watt, the Deputy Donahue was looking at earlier on. And just, I wanted just an explanation of some of the terms used just initially in the column decision taken in review. The phrase approved for payment to new beneficiaries, that means then that it maintains for those, and it's going for new people, okay. And then allowance subject to review or modification, that means that it's part of the 88 that are being put to review now. What does that mean?
No, that's part of the overall review of pay structures. So can we amalgamate this duties allowance into the overall review of pay structures? Because as in response to Deputy, we recognise that these are elements of pay, built up and effective elements of pay, but they need to be called what they are. Okay, so they're apart from the delegates allowance, which has been abolished, none of these are part of the 88. These are going to be subject to review, modification, and also part of the medium-term approach in terms of pay consolidation.
Okay, so where I see that description, I can take it that it's intended that that allowance or that amount will move into pay eventually. Okay, and so are any of the 88 in this list then that the Minister talked about in the review?
No. We've given you the 88 separately, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Just then to look at the service office supervisory role.
Yeah.
You were talking earlier about certain allowances being paid, say the principal allowance in schools, that is for what would effectively be a higher salary grade, and they should have done that. Is that what this allowance is? Is that one of those?
The service office supervisor, so in a government department there will be a number of service officers, service attendants who would man the front desk, who would organise the post, who would organise the facility, the management facility, and there's a head, there's somebody who's appointed to manage the group of staff in our own department.
Okay.
I think we have about 20 service officers, so there's one individual who's head, and make sure that everybody does what they're supposed to do.
Just that second sentence under the description, this allowance is for acting as head services officer in the absence of that officer.
For acting as deputy head service.
So there is an officer, but
yeah, it depends on whether it's spread across a number of different, like a department might have a number of different buildings, so there are different structures depending on how it's organised. But in effect, that's part of pay for doing higher duties, for having responsibility for managing the staff and for ensuring that those duties of the service attendants are actually carried out.
And that first part of the explanation I was talking about, there is a head services officer, but this person is getting paid the allowance to act in that role because the officer isn't present.
Yeah.
What does that mean? Sorry, does that mean that that they're out sick,
in that case, the person then is the deputy head, who would be the second in command, who would be given delegated responsibilities, or who would act in the absence of the head.
Are they delegated those responsibilities on a permanent basis, or is it just when the head is out?
Yeah, I think it's when, in the absence of the officer, or acting as. Or acting as, so it's in the absence of the officer, depends on the structure, deputy, so in the absence of the officer, or acting as the deputy head, where department is spread across a number, so I presume that the person could be, the service officer for a particular building as part of a department wouldn't be the head service officer for the entire department. Like our own department now would spread over a number of offices, a number of complexes.
Okay, so you'd have a head services officer, say, in the main building, and then you'd have someone else act up as a deputy head in the other buildings, and that's how that works.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
And that seems to be quite common. As you can see, there's 47 of them around the system. That's quite a common. Thanks.
Thank you for that. Just moving now to the driving allowance. The first part of that description is paid to service officers engaged on driving duties on a daily or full-time basis. So that's because they drive in their job, or?
Yes.
So they're are they hired to be drivers, or are they hired to?
No, they wouldn't be required to drive on a daily basis. They may be required to do some driving as part of their functions. And it depends if it's a full rate or a half rate. But officers engaged in driving duties on a daily or full-time basis,
Perhaps I really better jump in. Most of these allowances, I know they have specific definitions around them. So you've got supervisory allowances that very clearly are where somebody might be brought in. There's a head service officer grade pay rate, but then there'd be an allowance for somebody who's brought in and who basically semi-permanently, often after competition, comes in as a deputy supervisor or comes in as a role, as Robert suggested, where you're in charge of a building subject to a head supervisor who's in charge of a complex. The driving allowance, the franking allowance, those sorts of allowances, many of which, as you see, date back to the dawn of time in some cases, were brought in where additional roles are, like what you have is a service officer. They're paid on a service officer scale. But then some service officers have functions that were regarded, certainly at this time, as being additional higher responsibility. In charge of a franking machine, for example, that's a financial value to that. So the franking machine, which was a postal machine, like there was a financial responsibility attached to that. So there would have been an allowance introduced at that time to reflect those greater responsibilities beyond the norm of a standard service officer, if I can put it that way. But clearly these pay structures are now not reflective of what we would, the sort of normal flexibilities we expect of civil servants, including these service officer grades. So it is our intention, as it would be in the other sectors where allowance-based pay structures have become, are there, to look at trying to bring a more modernised pay structure reflective of the fact that you might have somebody who has a level of responsibility that's very low and somebody who might have a level of responsibility that's higher. But they wouldn't have titles like driving or franking, or they would allow for movement of persons into different roles. And this is work that's been done in a number of different areas. It just simply hasn't been done yet for the service officers. So it's the sort of work that we would like to do for the pay structures of service officers. It does take time, however, because you have to do pay banding and things like that. So it's a more elaborate exercise that could be carried out in.
And if you look back, just to add to it, if you look back at the date of first payment for a number of these, some of them are back to the 1950s, in the various 70s and 80s. So it was something which was put in place at a time when that particular duty would have been new, or would have been a position of some responsibility, or as soon as they're looking after a particular, and we're trying to tighten it up. But I think the key issue here for the committee is that there is a plan in terms of now rationalising and moving these structures onto a more modern pay approach. The amounts of money are modest, and the numbers of people who claim these are a small proportion of the overall system. But we accept that we need to finish this exercise and finish this work and move to a more modern, which not only would have some of these reflected in pay, but would also then clearly define the duties and responsibilities in a way which suits our business needs of today, as opposed to the business needs of the 1980s or whatever.
Second sentence mean there, half of this allowance is payable to staff assigned to driving duties, but who are not required to drive on a daily basis. When you say half of the allowance, what does that mean?
It's half rate. If you see,
Sorry, so the 24
half
yeah.
rate, presumably, yeah.
And it goes to people who aren't required to drive on a daily basis.
Yeah. So to drive sometime. Yeah.
Okay.
Staff side driving duties who are not required to drive on a daily basis.
So they're getting paid an allowance because they may have to drive in the course of the working week, but it's not certain that they do drive in the course of the working week. And what we're going to do is we're going to put that into core pay, increasing the salary.
But what we're going to do, and we need to engage with the staff side here, is what we're going to look at the responsibilities and look at what responsibilities ought to be now and modernise to reflect the fact that there are duties which should be part of normal duties and no longer considered to be exceptional, which may have been exceptional or unique when they were first put in. So it's to try not just in terms of defining these in a different way, but actually trying to ensure the work reflects the realities of the business needs today. Like I should say, Deputy, and it's important, in the context of the previous discussion, to look at the amounts here we were talking about. You're talking about very modest amounts of money. And you are talking about service officers here who are paid a maximum of less than 500 a week. So you are talking about on low pay.
I understand that. What I'm trying to understand is, say that person who isn't required to drive in a week, and we don't know if that person drives at all in a month, say, but they're still going to get half the allowance, and we're going to move that into core pay.
The way, without going into how we would approach this debate with the unions, the way in which this has occurred on previous occasions, for example, there has been similar work done for state industrials, which is another group of public service not covered in here, is that you look at pay banding. It's a very common experience in the private sector also. And what you say is, what are the normal roles and functions of a person in that role, and then you put them onto a particular pay band that reflects. And in effect, then instead of saying somebody who might occasionally drive a car or drive a van for their work gets a particular allowance or half an allowance or whatever, what you say is, if you're on that pay band, it is a normal part of your work to drive a vehicle, and therefore if you're assigned to drive a vehicle on a particular day, you just get to do that, and it's part of the flexibilities of normal working. So we move off a structure where what you have there in the description in the first column is a description of what the allowance was designed to cover when it was introduced, or how it has evolved over the years. So that's the description. And what we're saying is, as you can see, that's no longer fit for a sort of a modern, more flexible public service. So we have to move from that into a structure that more closely aligns with the normal flexibilities that we require in employment.
And so the driving allowance would have been paid originally in 1977.
Yeah.
It says reviewed with effect from the 1st of March 1991. Does that mean that they stopped paying it out to new entrants or new?
No, that was the last time it was subject of any significant review.
And when would have the last time would have been that we would have approved that allowance to go to a member of the civil service?
I can't tell you that, because obviously the civil service is spread across many departments, but all of these allowances were payable to new beneficiaries up to the 31st of January, and they have been approved subject to that wider review going on. So they could well have, of this year, I mean, as part of the allowance review, and they have been approved pending the medium-term review, which requires a great deal more work. So they are now, there could well have been one payable in the last few months as a consequence.
After Croke Park would have been agreed.
Oh, of course. So these are pay allowances. These would have been
the kind of flexibilities we were trying to achieve with the Croke Park agreement.
And
pay, and we said we would try and find greater flexibility in the workplace, but then we decided to pay an allowance on top for that greater flexibility.
Well, the allowance was